we're super excited to launch the semester with one of the most esteemed diplomats that I've been so lucky to learn from, Ambassador Lino Gutiérrez, who now has been enjoying retirement for a while, but I have to do a little bit of a chapeau because his bio is just unbelievably impressive. Started at the State Department at the ripe age of 25 in 1977.
That's right.
Had an illustrious career over 29 years, serving 6 presidents and 13 secretaries of state. He served as acting Assistant Secretary of State in the Western Hemisphere Bureau. He was there during 9/11. He served as ambassador to Nicaragua and as ambassador after that. So he has had an amazing career, and even after retirement, what I find so impressive is that he has dedicated his post-retirement life to still work in not only in diplomacy, but fostering a more diverse and inclusive space for all Americans to consider this very important policy-making career path. So we're so lucky to have him, and with that short chapeau of such an amazing biography, I just wanted to just dive right in, Ambassador Gutierrez.
Let's do it.
And ask you, you are a native of Havana, Cuba.
I am.
You went to college in Miami, I think?
In Alabama.
And in Alabama.
Right.
So you started off, in Cuba and in the South in the United States.
Right.
How did you find yourself leading into the path of the Foreign Service and diplomacy?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that as a child in Cuba, I never thought I would be a diplomat, much less an American diplomat.
One, yeah.
I thought I would be an astronomer or something like that. My father was a mathematician.
Wow.
Taught at the University of Havana. And we lived a middle-class existence. I'm an only child. And everything changed one day when my mother told me to get up and get under the bed. When the Bay of Pigs operation was beginning, and there was a bombing of the Air Force base in Havana, and we could hear the anti-aircraft fire and everything. So I dived under the bed, and that was the beginning of our saga, in that it led us to eventually leave Cuba in 1961 and go to Cali, Colombia.
Wow.
Where we had relatives. And from there, my father was a math professor. He had some contacts in the U.S. And he was hired at the University of Alabama.
Wow.
And I got there in time for the civil rights struggle and George Wallace and all that. So we went from the fire into the frying pan instead of the frying pan into
the other
fire.
way around.
Right.
Wow, that is just amazing, because that must have had an indelible effect on your desire to follow this field.
Well, it made me wonder what are the factors that led to our leaving, and international politics playing a factor, the United States, the Castro regime, etc. So when I was a freshman at the University of Miami, and then because my father was having a sabbatical there, and then we went to the University of Alabama. And there I gravitated toward political science, which is what interested me.
Yeah.
I think my father had hopes that I would become a mathematician, but
only child, high expectations.
we'll blame Fidel Castro for that, for not. But so yeah, I graduated with a degree in political science, and then what do you do exactly? That's the dilemma of all political science majors.
Yes.
I hope none here have any problems, but. At that time, you could take a test called the FSEE, the Federal Service Entrance Exam.
Okay.
And I took that, and
in the 70s.
In the 70s, late 70s, and I was offered 2 jobs. One was working for the IRS in South Alabama, but not as a tax specialist or anything. I was the enforcer, the repo man who would repossess people's cars.
Oh my goodness.
And that didn't appeal to me too much. The other job was a GSA in Atlanta. And even though Hotlanta was a place to go in those days, I opted to teach. My father was a professor, my mother was a teacher. So I stuck around, got a teacher certificate.
Wow.
And then I drove my '66 Mustang, tennis racket and black and white TV to Miami, Florida, where I tried to get a job teaching. And when I got there, all the school system jobs were taken because I got there in August. So my cousin and I were supposed to get an apartment, and he had his job. He was an accountant, and I didn't have a job. But then I looked in the newspaper want ads. So maybe some of the students don't know what that is. And there was an ad that said, teachers needed. I said, okay, let me follow that up. And I went to an address in Liberty City in Miami, which is a black community.
Okay.
And a new school was being started for dropouts and suspended students.
Wow.
And they hired me. They hired me as a social studies teacher. And we prepared students for the GED.
Excellent.
And to get back to the school system.
Excellent.
So I taught for 2 years in Liberty City in Miami.
That is so amazing. And then how?
And then the University of Alabama offered me an assistantship to get a master's in Latin American Studies. So I went back there, and I was lucky enough to be called by the Foreign Service and came to Washington, passed the oral, and before you know it,
and there you go.
I was in a room with 30 other people.
30 other people.
Yeah, only a class of 30.
And in the context, now we have classes of
90-something,
90,
yeah.
80 students. So that's very small.
And I was the only Hispanic, Latino, Cuban, whatever. There were 4 women out of the 30.
Wow.
2 African Americans, and one of the African Americans was in the Foreign Agricultural Service, because we had 2 FAS people
In the State
in
Department.
the A100
orientation.
class.
Wow.
The other one was Ambassador Howard Jeter, who many of you may know, who became a very successful ambassador in the Foreign
Wow.
Service. And I said, what am I doing here? You know? All these people from the Ivy League and Georgetown and all these and a Cuban American from Alabama is sitting right here with you. Okay, with a beard even. But, you know, the rest is history. I stayed 29 years. Within 3 months, little training, I was off to the Dominican Republic to do visas.
That was your first tour.
First tour, and had an enjoyable 29 years with ups and downs, different administrations, different challenges.
Amazing.
But it was great.
So I'm still kind of just taking in this amazing story of how you went from Cuba to Colombia to the South. And I'm just wondering, as you entered in the late 70s and then over the 29 years, how, you know, as you say, you were the only Latino, the only Cuban, the only so many things, and even just being one of a few people of color in that initial class. Since that initial point and throughout your career, how did you see your identity kind of evolve as you were becoming, you know, going from a junior diplomat in the Dominican Republic to mid-level onwards?
Well, it was a challenge. In those days, there were no mentors per se. In my current job with the Cox Foundation, we have worked with the State Department on trying to institute a mentoring system for the career Foreign Service. But in those days, there was nobody.
No, nobody.
So, you know, it was a matter of talking to people, finding out. Starts with A100. How does the assignment process work? You know, what do you do? How do you ensure that you get the assignment you want? Who can help you? And it was trial and error for me. And I would say, if I can make a categorical statement this early in the interview, that it helped me as much as it hurt me. At the end of the day, I think it was a wash for me. While some people resented perhaps the fact that I'd come to the Foreign Service and wondered whether I'd come in through the front door or the back door. Was it a minority hire or something like that?
Yeah.
There were others who were very, you know, progressive in their views and wanted to help.
Yeah.
And there came a time when it became fashionable, diversity became more fashionable, which it wasn't that much in the 70s.
It wasn't at that time, yeah.
And then the system wanted to push me ahead and said, look, we got one right here. And, you know, if a door is open, you take advantage of it.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of my colleagues who came around those years, you know, suffered from not having a good mentoring system. You know, in the Hispanic culture, I think humility is something that is, you know, thought to be a good thing. And lobbying, which you have to do in the Foreign Service to get your assignment, runs counter to your nature sometimes. So that's something you have to learn, and how much, because if you over lobby too, that's also bad. But, you know, I had some very good bosses, and I developed my own network, and they helped me throughout my career. So, you know, I think I was helped as much as hurt.
And were there any added challenges or successes by being one of the first Hispanic Americans in the Foreign Service, and then but then spending so much of your career in the Western Hemisphere Bureau?
Yeah.
How did that play out for you?
Well, I think it was a tremendous advantage when my first tour was the Dominican Republic. And I needed no climate, you know, to get acclimated or anything like that, because I understood the culture perfectly, because it was very similar to the Cuban culture. So I knew that if a Dominican politician was half an hour late, it wasn't because of me. It's called hora latina. You know? You come in a little later. You understand that. And you understand when people are, you know, I could tell when people would be, you know, not telling me the truth exactly. And things like that. So to me, it was an advantage to come in like that. I've heard some of your other interviews, and I know some fellow minorities have said that in some situations, sometimes American citizens or other visitors to a consular section would want to say, I want to talk to the real American. That had happened to me a couple of times. And one guy just came in and said, you're just a goddamn clerk. So,
oh my God.
You know, but that comes with the territory. And visa work is challenging.
It is challenging.
And it's tiring. It really wears on you when you have 150 people lining up saying they want to travel to the U.S. and you're what either facilitates that trip or denies it. And I had never had to say no to anybody. So that was hard at the beginning. Trying to find the right balance in your visa decisions. But you know, you understood when people many times were not telling you the truth, and those who were. So I think diversity as a whole is a plus.
Of course.
I mean, I think studies have shown, McKinsey and others, how companies that have a diverse workforce or diverse members of their boards do a lot better.
They just perform better.
That's been proven. Understanding all the markets and everything. And I think it's the same way in the Foreign Service.
And it's evolved a lot, right? I mean, I'm thinking about the progression of your career, especially aligned with kind of the historical movements of our own country. You probably, you know, you were serving our country overseas during some very crazy and chaotic moments in our own history.
Right. It was a different world. I mean, today's world is very messy. It's you don't know where the enemy is. You have international terrorism. Embassies have become fortresses. I remember my second tour was Lisbon, and the embassy was in the middle of downtown. You walked out of the embassy, and there was a Chinese restaurant next door, the Indian restaurant on the other side. Those days are gone. I mean, our embassies now are set back, sometimes on a hill.
Somewhere far away from people.
Somewhere far away. So, you know, things have changed.
So speaking of change, you know, as you kind of went through that, you know, the decades of the experience you've had, and then even since you've retired, I think you alluded to it a little bit already, but how have you personally felt and even just professionally experienced the evolution of the way State Department, or maybe just the foreign policy community in general, has changed in how they approach diversity and inclusion?
Well, in my 29-year careers, I saw maybe 25 attempts to reform the Foreign Service.
Wow.
In one way or another, from, you know, there were new ideas, new administrations, new people coming in. I remember Warren Christopher wanted to eliminate all deputy directors and all all regional offices, and that was a threat to me because I was the head of the regional office in Western Hemisphere Affairs.
Wow.
So the assistant secretary named me to be on the team.
And you were like,
but
wait.
maybe to sabotage what they were doing. But you know, have been a lot of good intentions. And as far as diversity is concerned, a lot has been tried, from recruiting in historically black colleges and universities and Hispanic serving institutions to, no, let's go to the Ivy League and get the best and the brightest, back and forth. And after 29 years, for example, the percentage of Hispanics when I came in was 4%.
It hasn't changed that
The
much.
percentage of Hispanics when I left was 4%.
Yeah.
And it wasn't for lack of trying. Many things were tried. One thing that did help a lot was when Colin Powell was named Secretary of State, and when people could see a face that looked like them, the number of minorities who took the test increased significantly. And some things were tried, like internship programs that could lead to a pathways job or some kinds of job. But those were discontinued later on. So, you know, the State Department keeps trying. I think now you have dips in residence in many places, and they have redoubled their efforts, and the numbers have gone down a little bit, especially with African Americans and Hispanics, but they're not anywhere close to what the general population.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Looks like.
Yeah, I think that when you think about the context of from when you started into now, it's kind of amazing to think about programs that actually were initiated that are no longer in place now. But then some, like Pickering and Rangel Fellowship Program, that is still doing almost what I feel like a Herculean effort to continue to recruit diverse candidates.
I have served as in the selection committee for the Pickering Fellows 3 or 4 times, and I can tell you that the people who are selected are among the best.
Amazing.
They're amazing. They come in with a master's. They come in with training, with 2 internships. So they are set up to become very good Foreign Service officers.
And not for a lack of I mean, I look at the candidate pool now, and it's like you have a hard time selecting because there's so many amazing, diverse candidates now.
And more. I mean, the number this year, I think, doubled of applicants from I did it 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And now it's a lot harder job because you got to go through a lot more applications.
Right, exactly. Rigorous process.
Right.
So you talked a little bit about this, and I love kind of taking a little bit of time to talk about this topic in every session, which is mentorship and champions to have who help you throughout your career. And you alluded to this, and I think a lot of folks outside of the Foreign Service, this is just like very unique to the Foreign Service culture, the lobbying and bidding process too. And I think what you mentioned for the Hispanic American community, which as a South Asian American, it was the same thing for me, first generation. Every time lobbying feels almost like anathema to my own culture because my parents always taught me to just, keep your head down, be humble, like do not like tout any of your accomplishments. So it feels very weird. But, when you think about mentors and champions, I'm sure you probably soon saw with the dearth of that there needed to be someone to fill those shoes. And I know so many of my own colleagues who still look to you as mentors, as a mentor, and they're still in the Foreign Service. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience, how did you cultivate that when you didn't have anyone when you first started?
Well, I just started with A100, and the A100, your colleagues coming into the Foreign Service became your first network.
Right.
And exchanging views, talking to the guy who was assigned to Bahrain, and I'm in the Dominican Republic, what's it like there? Where are you going next? What is your CDO, your career?
Development officer.
Well, they call it destruction officer.
Destruction officer, yeah.
Who is not your advocate. He is a guy who's trying to fill all the
slots,
jobs. So he represents your competition as well.
Exactly.
I think it took me 4 years to realize this is not my lawyer. But you start with that, and then your supervisors, someone who you clicked with.
Right.
So in the Dominican Republic, 2 of the political counselors became friends.
Okay.
And one of them, who had a very interesting career because he was a political appointee who stayed, burrowed in. He was spokesman for the department when Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State, and was fired by Henry Kissinger, and would tell a lot of stories. And he and I clicked very well, and he recommended me for my next couple of jobs. So starting with that, you develop your network, your friends, your team.
So you kind of developed through networking
Right.
some mentors along the way.
Mentors and colleagues and friends, and then the people coming in behind you, you sort of had an obligation to tell them what you knew.
Absolutely.
To help them
and HECFA, which is the Hispanic Employee Affinity Group at not only for State Department, but it actually exists throughout the foreign affairs community.
Right.
Was it even an organization back then?
It didn't exist when I came in, and then it started very timid-like, because at that time, I think, in listening to Ambassador Thomas Greenfield's interview,
Yeah.
she pointed out that when she came in, there were 2 lawsuits. She came in a couple of years after I did, with the African American Foreign Service officers and a group of women
Yes.
who had sued the department,
Sued the department, yes.
and won,
Yes.
and got some relief from the State Department. The Hispanics never
Went through
complained,
that
sued.
challenge.
No,
Yeah.
not at all. I guess the humility of the culture was paramount then. Although there were some, like my friend Chris Arcos, who was former ambassador to Honduras, and he came from the public diplomacy side. He was an advocate of filing a lawsuit and other things. So.
But in general, people weren't trying to
No.
buck the whatever
Well,
trend or
they were trying to get their voice heard. But
Right.
today, you have the affinity groups a lot better organized, and you see the State Department leadership,
recognizing.
yeah, being compelled to recognize it, to
Yes.
meet with it, to sit down with
Yes.
these groups, and that didn't exist then.
Yeah, because I know so many of my friends and colleagues are part of HECFA leadership now, and whenever I ask them who their champion or mentor is, you are undoubtedly one of the first names that comes out of their mouth.
Well, I met a lot of them through the Pickering
Program.
and Rangel Fellows Association, through ICAP,
Yes.
the mid-level program. So I've been active in many of these, and the Cox Foundation, where I work, has done a number of diversity programs in the last few years. So.
No, it's amazing that you've continued to champion these initiatives. Thinking about this question that I also ask all of the interviewees is, especially you have such a rich career spanning so many different historical time frames. Did you feel like at any moment or at any part of your career that you were advocating for a certain policy or perspective that people either initially just recoiled at or had some kind of differing opinion from you, and how did you handle that? How did you manage in a situation? Because I think when I ask this question, so many of my colleagues and mentors will talk about, dealing with imposter syndrome / trying to make sure your voice is heard, and, being, for example, my family is Muslim American, but if I'm the only person in the room talking about what Muslims face, how do you deal with those challenges?
Well, in my case, I believed in the system. I believed in American values. I believed in what the U.S. was trying to do overseas. I didn't always agree on how to get there.
Yeah, of course.
And I would speak up when I felt this is not the right way to do it. And I would either write a memo. I never used the dissent channel, but I could have. But I tried to persuade my colleagues and others to follow a different path. Sometimes I succeeded, sometimes I failed.
Of course.
But I believed in the system, and I believed in the objectives of U.S. foreign policy, if not always the tactics that we used.
So you never had a moment where it was very challenging to kind of manage the
Well, when I was in the Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau as a Cuban American,
Yes.
Cuba is a very big
Deal. Yeah.
deal. It punches way above its weight for an island of 11 million people. Haiti is another one that also,
Yes.
because there are domestic constituents,
Of course.
states that have large migrant populations and all that. So I, in a couple of occasions, I disagreed with the way some things were being handled.
Yes.
And, we had meetings about it. I spoke
Yeah.
about it and maybe wrote a memo. But at the end of the day, you work for the president
exactly,
and at the
absolutely.
pleasure of the president. So,
Absolutely.
I had a colleague who did not agree with the policy,
Okay.
but he didn't resign. He has to be changed
To a different bureau.
to the same bureau, but a different
office.
And they accommodated him. So there are ways to handle that.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
And I think that goes, I guess as a Foreign Service officer, that is, of course, part and parcel of what we are signing up for. But I think that it's always good to remind, prospective students or prospective officers, because that is, I think, the question we get undoubtedly in this day and age, which is, what do you do when you're grappling with the personal and professional, and maybe, how you feel morally or just policy-wise. And I think we all in the Foreign Service can count on many fingers the amount of times we may disagree with the policy, but you still
It's a
follow
personal
through.
decision. Some people feel like they have to resign.
Exactly.
Others
Make the decision to stay.
may not be able to afford to resign, so they could ask to be moved, etc. But I counsel younger officers to stay if possible, because we will need them
Yes.
in the future. And if everybody resigns, who's left, right? So, but it is a personal decision.
And my last question before I stop monopolizing and let the students ask some questions too, which is I love to talk about the current and then the future. You have clearly done so much since you retired 14 years ago, in this space, still so active.
Don't remind me, it's been
fostering diversity and inclusion, which is interestingly, I think many of my colleagues who maybe joined in the last 10 to 15 years, we at least came at a time where this was a topic we didn't have to argue that was important. Now it's just, how do you rectify and improve upon the system? You have done so much through Cox, through your even an adjunct professor at universities here in DC. You've been working, at the Pickering and Rangel doing interviews. Through all of these different experiences through the American Academy of Diplomacy, what are you taking away from your experiences in the last few years as lessons to look to the future to improve in the diversity inclusion?
Well, we've come a long way. The Cox Foundation supports the Director General in a lot of her efforts, and one of the things we have helped with was this unconscious bias course that people are now can take to see if they have an unconscious bias when they judge people, etc. Mentorship is key. And we just commissioned Deloitte to do a study on the senior foreign service as to why there are so few women and minorities.
Yeah.
And I think what they found essentially was that there isn't, the problem is not discrimination per se, but the fact that recruiting efforts have lagged in the last few years.
Yeah.
So the cohort coming up is a lot smaller.
Yeah.
So that's why you don't have as many promotions, but the groups are being promoted at the same rate as their white counterparts.
And it's the atmosphere, right? If you feel like you're being supported, then you feel like it's, there are things that can be improved. But if you don't feel like there's an atmosphere of support.
And there are a lot of mechanisms, the EEO, the Civil Rights Office. I'm also in the Foreign Service Grievance Board, so I see a lot
you
of
are
those
still
problems.
very active in all the Foreign Service.
You see more than you may want to see. But,
sadly.
But there are mechanisms for people to be helped.
No, absolutely. Well, I will leave it there because there's still so much to touch upon, and I'm sure some of the students, you guys probably have some thoughts or questions. So I'll leave it to you to. Otherwise, I have more.
You look kind of shy to me.
Yeah, I have questions, of course, but I will leave it to you guys. Just if you have, just take a second, and we'll pass the mic to them, right? And just say your name briefly, undergraduate or graduate student, and your question.
Are any of you considering the Foreign Service?
Can you pass we could just bring the mic up here. Anybody have a question? Are you all guys, go ahead, get started. We always need one person to start.
Hi, I'm Jacob, and I'm an undergrad. So my question's more about recent policy or different recent things that have happened in South America. So in Argentina, Alberto Fernandez was just recently elected, and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner was just brought back. What is your opinion on that, and what effects do you think that's going to have on Argentina and U.S. relations? Yeah.
Well, I was in Argentina as ambassador under Cristina's husband, Nestor Kirchner, when he was president, 2003 to 2006. And for the first 2 years, we had a good working relationship, considering that he came from the Peronist party, which is very populist, etc. But it was not after 9/11. There was good cooperation on counterterrorism, and then in 2005, President Kirchner, the husband, hosted the Summit of the Americas, and there things kind of fell apart because the Argentine government started working with Hugo Chavez of Venezuela and some of the other allies in order to stop the free trade area of the Americas at that time, and our relationship cooled quite a bit. And I think then Cristina became president after Nestor Kirchner died, and unfortunately, she actually took populism a little further and really, broke with the IMF, broke with the international institutions, and allied herself with Chavez and Cuba and Bolivia at that time. So when the last President Macri was elected, I saw a lot of hope for Argentina to solve a lot of their economic problems, their corruption, economic mismanagement, etc. But as happens, reformers sometimes can't show enough results. So now you have Alberto Fernandez, who had worked for Nestor Kirchner, but he felt he had to bring Cristina as his vice president. And the question is, how much will he depend on her and her people, who are not friendly toward the U.S. or the West, in order to govern? I'm hopeful that Alberto Fernandez can, be somewhat independent, and that we can work with him. But we'll see what happens, because I think Cristina's clients, some of the labor unions, these pressure groups called the piqueteros and people like that, are going to demand their pound of flesh. So I hope good sense, common sense prevails. But I think the United States should try to work with Alberto Fernandez and see if we can steer him at least on a moderate path.
Well, clearly you've still kept in touch with the state of play in some of the areas of Latin America that clearly still need our due attention.
Yeah.
Any other questions or thoughts from students? I have many questions. Well, one I wanted to ask you was to further delve into how to get better at recruitment.
Yeah.
So what I've noticed is that, and you alluded to this with the 4% when you started and kind of 4% when you left, specifically with the Hispanic American recruitment, it is nowhere near reflective of the demographic of our country, especially as we see the population of our country continue to grow.
It's 18%.
It's the highest disparity that I see amongst the minority community in the Foreign Service, through all the different Asian American, African American, Hispanic American. And so I'm wondering, what is your take on how we can do better, not just at Hispanic serving institutions, but just universities throughout the country that maybe we're not looking at or reaching, that maybe would be interested in policy, outside of the Beltway, of course, I'm sure.
No, I think part of the problem is that in the Hispanics who come to the U.S., many are recent migrants.
Yes.
And in their tradition, being a diplomat is something one doesn't think about.
Right.
Usually immigrant parents want their children to be doctors or lawyers.
My mother.
Or teachers.
Yeah.
So diplomat, well, what's that, and why would you do that? Why does my little daughter have to go out there and get, be in dangerous path and all that?
Why did we come all the way here for you to leave?
So we need to send people out who are already in the Foreign Service, people like Ana Escrojima, who was here at Georgetown, and whom you did an interview with.
Yes, she's excellent.
And send her to New York City, where there's a large Dominican population, and others, and they can see somebody who looks like them.
Yeah.
And that's a way to get the conversation started. But we have great stories in the Foreign Service.
Yes.
We have Mary Vargas right now, who is in Mexico City. She grew up in a neighborhood that was controlled by gangs in Los Angeles. And she was destined to a life affected by the gangs, until a teacher saw something in her. And persuade her to apply to a magnet school.
Yeah.
Today, she's a Foreign Service officer serving in Japan. She served in Greece. No, I'm sorry. Mary's in Mexico City. I'm thinking of another one. She served in Israel, in Jerusalem. So there are great stories like that.
Yes, and my friend Greg Pardo, when he did this interview as well, I was just struck by his own experience growing up in Texas in a Mexican-American family. And if it wasn't for a teacher that saw something in him in high school, he wouldn't have even applied for community college, furthermore, then college, and then graduate school, and then enter the Pickering and Rangel program.
Right.
So it almost, the ability to lean into the network of educators who also have the ability to have that personal connection with those students and identify them as the future of diplomacy. That to me also feels like a huge resource.
Well, in my current job, we work with the Director General and with the recruitment arm of Human Resources.
Yes.
Who, they have increased the number of diplomats in residence
Yes.
to many more universities, and they're now assigning not people who are ready to retire, but people at the mid-level.
Yeah, for a long time, that was the job you took kind of at the tail end of your career.
Right. So students can identify a little more with the DIRs, perhaps, and don't have to say "Okay, boomer" to them. But that's something I don't condone, by the way. But no, so we've started a conference every year that we bring 27 to 28 students from Hispanic serving institutions, historically black colleges and universities, and bring them here for a 3-day intensive course in diplomacy. And the State Department lets them in, and they meet former ambassadors and FSOs. They do simulations on diplomatic problems. And it's a great, it's so heartwarming to see someone from Texas, from the border, who's never been on a plane, coming to Washington, D.C. and talking to Linda Thomas Greenfield or Julieta Noyes or Julie Chung, whom you're going to interview, and people like that. So you got to increase the contacts. REE now has a database of who the right people to reach out to are in these Hispanic serving institutions and historically black colleges and universities. So more contact, more internships, I would advocate, and spread the word.
Do you think financial abilities is still a main barrier for some folks to get into this field?
It can be a big deterrent, but with the Pickering and Rangel programs, that is a big equalizer too.
Huge.
If we could have more numbers of that, that would be great too.
I know, if only we had unlimited funds.
Well, that's true. But hopefully, the word will spread and more will apply with new generations now.
Attracted to, I think now it's not the lack of knowledge of the field existing, which perhaps some could say. It was funny when you're talking about your political science degree experience, because when I started undergraduate and then back in 2003, and I told my mother I was going to major in about political science, she was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, what is that? So I think at least we've come a long way, and even like this being a field to explain to immigrant families, it's just about getting them invested in this as an actual viable potential.
Right. One thing I found, a lot of the recent Pickerings and Rangels, the applicants, many of them come from this area because they're in Washington, D.C.
Oh, interesting.
They're more exposed to government. So many are the children of Central American immigrants, Salvadorans and Hondurans and Guatemalans, and they're applying for the Foreign Service.
Excellent.
So
awareness is there.
Awareness is there. Maybe the recent televised hearings where diplomats
did a little bit of lip service.
Might create a little interest
in the field
out there.
Yes, exactly. You guys have any questions, any thoughts before we wrap up?
No?
You look like you're hesitating.
Go ahead.
Please. And then we'll wrap up after that.
I'm Insha, undergrad here in the SFS, and my question was about, you were talking about the immigrant communities.
Right.
So a lot of them, it's systematically against them because of the areas in which they live and then the way that taxes are allocated to their schools. Do you see any issue in that, or like how we can move forward? Because
public schools?
with public schools, yes, specifically, yes.
Okay.
Well,
That's a good question.
I'm a product of public schools. I never went to a private school. But, you know, education is uneven in many places.
Yeah.
So I do think the State Department now sends people not just to the larger communities, but they're trying to, you know, reach areas like Dearborn, Michigan, which has a very big Arab American population.
Yeah.
Puerto Rico, you know, Texas border, etc., where the possible recruits could be for the future of the Foreign Service. So, you know, I do think in our efforts, we have to go to the high school level, and I've discussed
Yes.
that with many of my colleagues.
Ambassador Thomas Greenfield says that all the time, and I
Because
absolutely agree with,
by the time
with that.
minority students come to college, many of them already have a certain path in mind.
Yeah.
So you have to plant the idea
Early.
maybe in junior high or high school.
Early.
Now the U.S. Diplomacy Center, now called National Museum
Yeah.
of American Diplomacy,
Yes.
they do simulations for high school students. And we're supporting that too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And that's an effort, I think, that could be increased. And, you know, if you go to these, you know, a DC school and do a simulation about climate change or about fighting the coronavirus and what diplomatic measures
Yeah.
you take for that, these are real life problems that people could identify with.
Yeah, and I mean, as someone who grew up in a public school in New York City, in Queens, in the 90s, when it was very dangerous, it's changed a lot since then. I understand your question, which is, you know, when you're starting even at elementary school, almost, you know, with a disadvantage because you don't have the access to maybe the same resources. And I eventually ended up in private school in high school, but because my parents were recognizing that I wasn't getting the resources in public school, and they literally scraped all of their money together to put their children into private school. So I recognize the point of the problem, but I think Ambassador Gutierrez's point is also really apt, which is it's not only about, you know, perhaps a failing public school in a part of the United States, which is just that's just fact. But it's also about, I think what we were talking about earlier, which is, you know, leaning in on the educators, trying to find the right networks, trying to find the way to insert the seed of different careers, you know, like how little kids in elementary school in the United States, you know, you ask them, you have a career day, you know, they have the firefighter or the bus driver or whatever, or a doctor, but it's also like, who's the diplomat coming for career day, even in elementary school, to explain, you know, this is what we do at the State Department. We make the joke, so many of us, that, you know, when you go out, whatever, my parents live in upstate New York, where most folks don't even know what the State Department is, and they'll be like, what state, right? And so it's a part and parcel of the whole kind of information space of marketing that, and especially to communities where they really don't know, you know, what the State Department is and what, you know, their child could achieve with so many different international crises.
Maybe we should adopt some of these disadvantaged high schools, like, you know, corporations adopt
Yes.
sometimes, and that'd be an idea to identify some key places, and maybe the State Department could do something.
I mean,
like
that's another idea, but I think it goes to show that we're finally at a point now where we recognize that, you know, I mean, I'm sure when Ambassador Gutierrez joined decades ago, it wasn't even a conversation, but at least now we recognize that it needs to start at such an early age, so that when you guys come to Georgetown, it's amazing how much of a pipeline there is in this campus. I mean, I feel the energy around me when I talk to students. They're freshmen and they already know what they're doing junior year for their internship. And so it's daunting, but to remember that in other parts of this country, that pipeline doesn't necessarily exist, right? But we need to create that at a very early stage.
Where'd you go to high school?
I went to a public school in Texas.
In Texas?
Oh, so close to home.
Yeah.
Close, Houston.
In Houston. Okay.
as a New Yorker, I've never been to Texas, and that is my embarrassment. I need to rectify
You have
that.
to go? You're representing the U.S.
Yes,
You have to-
exactly. I feel that I need to visit Texas. Well, I will wrap up there. Thank you so much, Ambassador
My pleasure.
Gutierrez. This is such an amazing.
And thank you to the Institute that does great work, and I'm proud to be a member of their board.
Yes, we are so glad. Thank you.